Think forward. Think Research Channel.
Anpetuwashta, good afternoon. It is my very great pleasure to introduce someone whose courage and eloquence have contributed more than any other single source to putting so-called Indian mascots on the endangered species list. Charlene Teters is a member of the Spokane Nation. She was born and grew up in the city of Spokane, eventually came to live on the Colville Confederated Tribes Reservation, and from there journeyed to the prestigious Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe in 1984. After receiving an Associate of Fine Arts in Painting from IAIA in 1986, she attended the College of Santa Fe, from which she graduated in 1988 with a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Painting. From there, her journey took her to my own alma mater, the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where she had been recruited to the U of I's Department of Art and Design graduate program. She, along with fellow Native artists Norman Akers and Marcus Ammerman, arrived to find a campus steeped in the misuse of stereotyped American Indian symbols because of its Chief Illiniwek tradition dating back to 1926, where a non-native student would portray a fictional Indian chief by donning regalia, too often authentic and obtained by unfortunate means from highly honored elders of our nations, and then prance about the football field at halftime in an embarrassingly ignorant parody of some of our most valued traditions expressed through dance. She began a strong campaign against these symbols, particularly after she saw her own teenage children's self-esteem undermined in a community that often interacted with Indians through what it thought it knew about them based on the Chief Illiniwek stereotypes. Though she had already become well known in our communities before the appearance of Jay Rosenstein's award-winning documentary, In Whose Honor, the documentary helped bring her and her struggle to national attention. It also helped me complete a personal journey. I admit to loving football and would enjoy it when Illinois would win a game, except of course when they were playing Michigan. I used to attend Illinois games, though my wife and I would sit down in embarrassment and look at our feet when the Chief, as the mascot was familiarly known, would come onto the field at halftime. It offered an interesting insight into some unpleasant sides of human nature when some of the people around me, with whom we had been conversing quite pleasantly up to that point, would suddenly turn on us with quite a bit of venom when they understood what we were doing. We even had people who would try to forcibly stand us up and clap our hands together with exhortations to, hey, get with it. Of course, we felt at those times that we were about the only ones on that side of the field who were with it, but we continued to go to the games. It was after I saw In Whose Honor, with its graphic emphasis on what we were implicitly condoning by even being in the stadium when this travesty was going on, that we resolved that we would not be at any further Illinois football games until the Chief was gone forever. Though we honor her for being a warrior in this cause, I hasten to add that Charlene Teters' other accomplishments are many and greatly deserving of our recognition even without her stand against Chief Illiniwek and other offensive symbols. In addition to her Master of Fine Arts from Illinois, she has been presented an honorary doctorate in fine art from Mitchell College in Connecticut. She is an internationally recognized and widely exhibited artist who is currently Professor of Art at IAIA and has also served as Dean for Arts and Cultural Studies there, though right now she is currently on loan to Cal Poly, where she is Hugh O. LeBounty Endowed Chair of Interdisciplinary Applied Knowledge. She has served as senior editor of Native Artist magazine and is a founding board member of the National Coalition on Racism in Sports and the Media. Please join me in welcoming Charlene Teters.
I am very happy to be here and very humbled to be here in connection with the Martin Luther King Jr. Conference that has been going on month-long, so I'm very pleased to be here. Stamas bu'us slumta kuyas quest. I'm also known as Charlene Teters. This greeting in my language means what's in your heart. What's in your heart is sometimes hard to put into words. And Martin Luther King Jr. said it this way, and I quote, "There are times in life when words cannot express what one is feeling. It can only be expressed in the inaudible language of the heart." And today is one of those days. I am very honored to be here as part of this program, this month-long program, in the name of such a great man, a great leader. Martin Luther King Jr. is amongst the ancestors. And we are here today because of the strength of our ancestors who worked hard to keep things safe for us so that we could pass it on to the next generation. And so, in the spirit of Martin Luther King and our ancestors who have passed on these informations for us, these songs, these stories, the history, I want to share my own personal story. And as I share this personal story, in many ways, it's the story of many Native people across the country because they're so similar in terms of many of the struggles that we face. And so I want to start with just a personal history of my own family. My grandmother was born February 2nd, 1900, and given the reservation name Nancy Moses. At that time, they were not allowed to use their Indian names. And in our part of the country, we call them hat names because their names were taken from them and they took their name out of a hat. So my grandmother was born February 2nd, 1900. Her mother, my great-grandmother, her name was Shishimta, and that hat name that she was given was Ellen Moses. My great-great-grandfather's name was Chtutsi, and his hat name was Joseph Moses. Although those names went underground, they were kept alive and given again by people in our family, but not spoken publicly. My mother completed that circle by giving my children those two names, and we did that in ceremony 2 years ago. So Shishimta was given to my daughter, and Chtutsi was given to my son, so that those names could now be spoken today in the present. But that was part of the history of many of our people in this country, in that the names that we had for ourselves, our songs, our ceremony, our religious practice was, in many ways, had to go underground to be kept for us today. Because those songs couldn't be sung publicly, many of the bundles and feathers, the things that we used to pray with, were taken from the people. In some cases, they were burned. In some cases, they were given to institutions like historical societies. So the fact that we have those songs and stories today is truly a miracle, because so much was done to interfere with the transference of that information. And part of the interruption was the language. my grandmother was a storyteller. The storytellers were our educators. And my grandmother, who could speak English fluently, her own form of resistance was to speak in her Spokane language and just enough English that her grandchildren would understand her. So I'm an educator, so within these Western models of education, you ask a question and the answer is this, and you memorize that answer. But within our societies, our culturally based societies, you ask a question, and often the answer would come in the form of a story. And those stories would sometimes go on for hours. And my grandmother, who was a storyteller, would answer our questions in that same form, the stories. And they would go on and on and on, and eventually she would forget and it would go back to Spokane. And she could tell when she lost us when she was looking at, her grandkids, and I was one of 6 children in my family. And she could see where she lost us because eventually we would have that look on our face. And she would say this, and it's only now as an adult that I began to understand the pain in what she said. She said, "My own grandchildren can understand me." And it's only now as an adult that I remember the pain in that statement. And then she would continue in Spokane and just enough English that her grandchildren could understand her. And within those stories were lessons about geography and morality and history and culture. They were filled, with so much information. But during the boarding school era, during the early 20th century, we lost a lot of information, the language. In these boarding schools, the children who were taken out of their families and in these boarding schools were taught to hate who they are. They were taught to think of those things as inferior. And so the transference of that information, that cultural information, was interrupted or not always interrupted forever, because some of that information continues to this day because of the strength of the ancestors who kept them underground for us. Much of what I know today, my sense of who I am as a Spokane woman, comes from my grandmother, my yaya. And as I travel around the country, I see through the aggression and through that deliberate destruction and interruption of that transference of information that we are still here. That we are not just here physically, we are here culturally and spiritually. And that's what we are protecting as we address some of these issues that face us as Native people. I began my own personal journey from Washington State to Santa Fe. And I went to Santa Fe to get an education. And that transition from my Spokane nation in Spokane to Santa Fe was relatively easy because I was going from one Native community to another. And I didn't have to explain who I am or why. And then from there, I was recruited to the University of Illinois after I achieved my Bachelor in Fine Arts. And there were 3 of us who were recruited: Norman Akers, who is an Osage man, and Marcus Ammerman, a Choctaw man. All of us came from our communities. We weren't somebody who thought we were Indian somewhere back there. We were people who came from our communities. And when we went to the University of Illinois, it was with a great deal of hope in our hearts because we were all first generation. And what we found there was a community deeply surrounded by these images, these caricatures of Native people. What we saw at Campus Town, which is one of, you have a very nice campus town I was visiting today. But our campus town had a bar that was called Home of the Drinking Illini, that had a neon sign that fell down over and over again. It was a neon sign of a caricature with a big belly, big nose, crosses in his eyes, broken feather falling down over and over again. And this is where the sorority and fraternity brothers and sisters would go before games, after games. It became a place where people would act out their stereotypes of Native people by putting on headdresses, putting on paint. Around us we saw, and of course the first couple of weeks of school is about introducing you to the new traditions. So the songs connected to homecoming, to sports, because we were a Big Ten school. Of course you are too, so you know what that means. It's a big deal. And so what we saw around us was caricatures of Native people, because that was the identity of the sports team. There was a sorority that had the Miss Illini Squaw contest every fall. And so what we felt when we were there was not welcoming. It was not comfortable. And we did not feel welcome here. And we couldn't fully participate in the activities of the first few weeks of school. Marcus Ammerman lived in a dormitory setting, student housing, and he had to deal with this activity up close and personal. And he left after being here only, I think it was less than a month, that he went home in the middle of the night without saying goodbye to anybody. And they broke the news to Norman and myself. We were left. And it was one of the professors who recruited us, and he said, Marcus left in the middle of the night. And he said, 1 little, 2 little, 3 little Indians, he said. 2 Indians left. And to us, it was devastating because we knew what it took for all of us to be there. And that simple nursery rhyme is about trivializing the genocide of the people. And then there are no Indians left. And so we definitely did not feel comfortable here, but we weren't sure what to do about it. And as an afterthought, that professor said, you can't do anything about this, so just keep your mouth shut, go to classes, get your degree, and then get out of here if you don't like it. And it sounded in some ways like the only solution, because we were only 2 Native people on this campus. And when you go to a new community, you look for your community, you look for people like you. And that's what we did. We asked the question, is there a Native student program? Are there other Native students here? How many Native faculty do you have here? Where's the Native community here? And we soon realized we were the Native American community, the 2 of us. And so we had no place to go, and there was no commitment to supporting us after we got there. So we tried to keep our mouth shut. But the problem is that you internalize all of this activity that's going on around you. And I went there with 2 young children. And I, like any of us who are parents, grandparents, we work hard to instill a sense of pride in our children and who they are. And so I thought my children would be okay, and so I tried to keep my mouth shut. When my children's self-identity began to be eroded by the activity of the fans and of the community, then I realized that I could not be in this community and not address it. And it became clear to me when I took them to a game. And this was back when, let's see now, what year was that? We were on our way to the Final Four. I'm trying to remember what year that was. And of course, we're not anti-sports. We love sports, Native people. You know, basketball's almost a sacred game to us, you know. So when we went to that game, sometimes people ask me, why did you go? We love sports. And that team was magic. It was Marcus Ammerman, it was Kendall Gill, it was Kenny Battle. Then there's maybe some of you who are a sports fan would remember the rest of them. They were very charismatic. And so my children wanted to see them play. And I said, we can do that, but you have to remember people are going to be doing all this other activity. And the same advice that was told to me, I passed on to them. You just have to ignore it. But again, the message is that you are internalizing the activities. You are internalizing that hate and that uncomfortableness. And so we went to the game, and and the team was very charismatic, and it was a wonderful game to watch. But the activities of the fans was very hard to take. They had their own form of their cheers, you know, their tomahawk chop. The cheerleaders were wearing paint. Fans were wearing paint and feathers. But when that mascot came out during halftime, dancing to the Hollywood chant, my son tried to laugh, like you laugh when you're the butt of the joke. And you don't want people to know how you hurt. That's what I witnessed. And my daughter just sank in her seat. She was so embarrassed because my children are traditional dancers. And when I saw that, I knew that I could not be there and not address the issue. And so I challenged it by holding a sign that said, American Indians are human, not mascots. And it wasn't really about changing the minds of people who came to the game. It was about telling my children that their identity was important to protect. And then I became targeted by the same people who targeted Marcus. And my phone, like Marcus's before, would not stop ringing. It was ringing day and night. And there was a point to where I stopped answering the phone and just let it go to the answering machine. But then my children would hear the comments, and they started to feel uncomfortable and unsafe in their own home. So I started to answer it, and they all start the same. Is this Charlene Teters? And then the hate would come. It was incredible that this criticism of that mascot, that this kind of hate was being directed at me and my family. And I started to think that I should leave because they were increasingly becoming more hateful. And my son, I overheard my son saying that he felt like they were death threats. And in the middle of some of these calls, I got a call from Ken Stearns of the American Jewish Committee in New York City. And of course, they all start the same. This is Charlene Teters, yes. And then Ken introduces himself. He was working on a document called Bigotry on Campuses. And so as part of that document and the research, he was monitoring student newspapers, looking at incidences of hate and racism, and then what the administration was doing to address it. And he, as an expert on anti-Semitism and hate, recognized the pattern because the media in this case was also being used to target me and my family. And so he called and he says, "It sounds like you need some help." And I said, "Yeah, I need some help here." And I started to explain to him what was going on, but he knew immediately. And I said, I think I need to leave. And his answer was, if you leave, they win, because that's what they're trying to do, is make you feel unsafe, uncomfortable in your environment. And he decided to use his position to help shed a light on the other side of this discussion, because he was a writer, he was an author. And so he also got me help in the form of safe houses if I needed to go in Chicago. The other person who called in the media was Tim Gallego in the middle of all of these calls. Tim Gallego was at that time was the editor of Indian Country Today and publisher. He's now gone on to form many national newspapers, and he had a nationally syndicated column. And so he'd been writing about this mascot issue, in particular the one at the University of Illinois, for many, many years before I got there. I didn't know that. I was describing the mascot, and he finished my sentence. And he says, I've been writing about that mascot, so what can I do to help you, he said. And so he started to use his position to shed a light on the other side as well of this issue. The other person who was very instrumental in helping at the University of Illinois was Kwame Ture, and you may know him as Stokely Carmichael. Kwame Ture was coming to campus, and in the midst of all of this media attention on me that was very, very negative, someone sent him a collection of these articles, and he read them, and so he knew about me. When he came to campus, he was a very charismatic speaker, and he would attract thousands of people who would come to see him speak. And he asked to meet with student leaders as part of the conditions for coming to campus, and I was invited to that circle. And Kwame Ture was very charismatic, and I was very, very shy at that time. I used to hyperventilate if there was more than 10 people in the room. I was so shy. Still am, actually. But I've gotten over the hyperventilation part mostly. And we were sitting around this table, and Kwame Ture was in his African regalia. And he asked everyone to introduce themselves. And they went around the room introducing themselves. And I was the only one that was not from an African American organization, student organization. And I was the last person to speak. And by the time it got around to me, I was really hyperventilating badly. And I was trying to remind myself to breathe and talk at the same time. And so my voice was very tiny. And I said, my name is Charlene Teters. And he turned and he said, I know you, my friend Wa Bunanini, he has told me about you. And then he turned to the people who brought him to campus and he said, I want you to give the sister 10 minutes of my time, he said. Remember, I'm very shy. And I looked out the curtains, and there was 3,000 people there to see Kwame Ture. And I was saying, I can't do this, I can't do this. I can't do this. I was trying to convince him. And he sat back and he said, if not you, then somebody else from the Native American community. If not you, then who? He said. And everybody in that room looked at each other. They went back around and I knew by the time I came back around, I had to do this. Because remember, the only other Native person on this campus was Marcus, and he was even shyer than I was. And so I went out there with my little piece of paper, and it was shaking, and I was really afraid. But I began to speak from the heart, and I closed my eyes, and my 10 minutes went, and I got a standing ovation. And as I turned from the microphone to go back to sit down, Kwame Ture reached for me like this to embrace me. And the media was there in the front row taking all this flash, you know. And it was on the front page the next day above the fold of Kwame reaching for me. And again, it was the media being used as a tool to try to make me look like I'm dangerous. See who she's associated with, kind of thing. But it backfired because people of consciousness in the community began to understand what this was about. And Kwame Ture got up to the microphone behind me and he said, "If this is an issue for Native American people, then this is an issue for you. Even if there were no Native people on this campus, there is no reason to stand back and let their culture be degraded," he said. "If you consider yourself an anti-racist, this is your issue too." And then he used the rest of his time to talk about how our struggles are linked. And after that, we had developed this multi-racial coalition to address this issue on campus. And it was really because of these people, as well as the American Indian movement who came in afterwards, that helped this particular struggle at the University of Illinois to be the catalyst for the national discussion that was going on. Because this is a very long and ongoing struggle. By the time I was at the University of Illinois in the 80s, it had been going on for 30 years. And it continues to this day in different forms, like this campus with the, let's see if I can remember, the Michigama. You have some kind of a secret society here. Michigama? Yeah, Michigama. Because I've been here before, and I remember the discussions around that, where they use these identities and these as part of their initiation, and they trivialize the struggles of the real people. And so we continue with these struggles, and we have to see how these struggles are linked. My experiences at the University of Illinois has forever changed me in many ways because the shy art student, I went into art because I didn't like to do public speaking. I thought as an art student, you just make art, right? So now my art has also been politicized in that I use my art as a way to make my voice bigger. And like my grandmother, who is a storyteller, I've become a storyteller in a different way. In many ways, it's a matter of survival. Michael Haney was very instrumental in helping to shed a light on this struggle when I was a student at the University of Illinois, and Michael Haney has also passed on to the spirit world. But I remember one of the first things that he said. We brought him to campus during one of the tailgate activities before the games. And we walked through there, and he didn't say anything. And so we walked through the tailgate activities, and we walked around where they use our identity mostly attached to beer wagons and parties. And so people are playing with all kinds of things central to our spiritual way of life as they're getting themselves worked up for the game. And we walked through there, and we came out, and I said, "Well, what do you think?" And Michael Haney has a kind of a dry sense of humor. And he said, "That was like Dances with Wolves on acid," he said. And he went on as we also brought him, and he stayed with us actually, to help to address this issue. And he said, "The longest undeclared war in history is the war against the American Indian here in our own homeland." And he says the Indian wars continue no longer in the battlefields, but in the courtrooms. corporate boardrooms and in the classrooms over the self-identity and religious items, images, our names of Indian people. And in a real sense, it's also about the self-esteem of our future leadership, our children. In reality, contemporary American Indians are not seen as real unless we look like the stereotypes. So we are made invisible in the hearts and minds of Americans. Since we are invisible, then so too is the racism that we suffer. Pop culture is very powerful. Pop culture has grown into a very powerful source of information, selling to America and really the world a global perception of American thinking. And amongst those thoughts is a pervasive global image of American Indians as these candy-coated stereotypes. And in many ways, it candy-coats America's racial attitudes towards the original people. From sports team mascots, we are things. We are things to be entertained by. We are things to be sold. We are things to create colorful legends about. We are things to claim spiritual clemency by. We are things to be backdrops. We are things to be mined. But in many ways, we are never seen as full-fledged human beings. To Boy Scouts, we are campfire stories. To the states of New Mexico, Oklahoma, and others, we are tourist attractions. To anthropologists, we are objects of study. To the University of Illinois and Florida State and others, we are mascots. We are entertainment. We are halftime entertainment. And we are the human beings. If you translate our names for ourselves, we refer to ourselves as the human beings, the first people, the original people. So it's hard for us to realize that we're still talking about the humanity of Indian people. And we're talking about very basic rights to protect those things that are central to our identity so that we can pass it on to the next generation. But I think it's important to make a connection that history plays a very important role in whether or not these images and names are racist. America and Americans have grown very comfortable with their image as a nation of innocence, that we have a just society. So it really shakes their sense of who they are when we talk about the history of subjugation, the history of removal, of forced assimilation, of genocide. But these stories and this history is important to understanding why these images and names are racist. Because as long as we are being defined by the dominant culture, then this history of subjugation is continued. So we have to know our past. We have to know our history to understand why it's important to remove these, especially from our public school systems. History plays an important role in whether an act, a symbol, is racist or not. We have a long and ongoing history of violence that continues to this day. Redskin really is about the history of genocide, where there was a bounty on the heads of Indian people. In California, the first governor put a bounty on the heads of Indian men, women, and children. This was during the gold rush. Indian people were an obstacle. They were in the way. And so they had to remove the people in order to get to the resources. it's important to understand the connection of history. And it's important that we remove these from the educational institutions, especially because they interfere with the true mission of an educational institution, which is to teach history and not reinforce stereotypes of any people. Wilma Mankiller came to our campus as one of our speakers when I was there as a student. And at that time, Wilma Mankiller was the principal chief of the Western Cherokee, the second largest Indian nation in the country. And I remember that day clearly. She was wearing a red suit and red high heels. And she talked about the history of the Cherokee people. And she talked about the history of removal. And she talked about how that story had been repeated many times across the country. And at the end, she was giving a press conference. And this was at the University of Illinois, and I was wondering how that was going to go. And I remember the press, one of the first questions was, what is the number one priority for your nation? And I thought, wow, okay, so maybe economic development or education. I was going through thinking what she might answer, but her answer was perfect. Her answer was, the number one priority for our nation is to get our young people to believe in themselves again, to trust their own thinking, because we know that within our educational institutions, our history is not taught. If you ask our young people, who are your heroes and sheroes, they have a hard time trying to pick from our history those heroes like Martin Luther King, like Rosa Parks. They have a hard time trying to think of a name of a Native hero or shero within our community. Is it because we don't have people who are doing great things? No. It's not written about. Those stories are not shared. And so our young people have a hard time trying to look within their own history for inspiration. And we have many people. Wilma Mankiller is one of those people of inspiration. She said, the number one priority is to get our young people to believe in themselves again, to trust their own thinking. And I remember her parting words to the press. Remember, she was wearing a red suit, red high heels. She said, I hope now you won't be confused by what a real chief looks like. Whose issue is this? We have been addressing this issue for 50 plus years. It is not just one person's issue. It's not just one person's problem. Our institutions have been addressing this issue for years. The National Congress of American Indians, the National Indian Education Association, the International Indian Treaty Council, and on, our National Journalist Organization. And they've been ignored. And for those who want to trivialize this issue, I say that racism is never trivial. And if it stands in the way of a people's self-identification and self-determination, these struggles are linked. In 1968, Memphis, Martin Luther King was standing with the sanitation workers during their strike. And the strikers held signs. I am a man. I am a man. When a people are talking about basic rights, their basic humanity, there is a problem that needs to be addressed by people of consciousness. This is the same. We are human. We are human beings, not mascots. Because when you dehumanize a people, we are vulnerable to acts of racism and hate. And we see the results of this hate every day, somewhere in Indian country. And when you dehumanize a people, then even our ancestral grave sites are not respected. When you dehumanize a people, then our sacred sites, those places that we go to pray, are not respected. When you dehumanize a people, our tribal governments are not respected and disregarded. When you dehumanize a people, and it's done so publicly on primetime television, I cannot protect my children from the Florida State Seminoles mascot doing these antics and the fans. And our children ask us, what's so wrong with being who we are, that this is going on? Whose issue? Whose responsibility? It is everyone's. This is not a Native American issue. It's an issue of human dignity. And if you consider yourself an anti-racist, then this is your issue too. And Jesse Jackson came to our campus too, and he said it this way: to reduce the victims of genocide to a stereotype symbol or mascot is immoral, and at worst, it's unthinking. If I could, I'd like to close. I'm an artist, and I make these installation pieces. And I use these words of Alice Walker as part of the text of an installation that I made. And she made these comments after seeing a collection of stereotypes and caricatures of African Americans. And what I did with the quote was to modify it, because it was part of my installation. So it's a modified quote by Alice Walker. These symbols and mascots are really intended as prisons of image. Inside each desperately grinning Cleveland Indian and each stoic Redskin brave or Chief-Illiniwek mascot, there is someone we know. If you look hard at these symbols and don't panic, you begin to see the eyes and then the hearts of these despised relatives of ours who have been forced to lock their spirits away from themselves and from us. I see our mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters, trapped and forced into images they did not devise, doing hard time for all of us. We can liberate them by understanding this and free ourselves. End of quote. Thank you.
And I know you brought up the Mishigwama and what takes place here. I guess my question is, when a country and its institutions have a history of racism, of ignorance, and a number of other things that dehumanize people and render us small against the backdrop of the mainstream culture, what do you recommend as the course of action to be taken by a younger generation who has to deal with issues that prior generations didn't necessarily have to deal with? There's racism that Arab Americans have to face in light of 9/11. Mm-hmm. Blacks, for instance, still have to face false images and propaganda based on hip-hop culture and other different things. What should be our focus as a younger generation dealing with all these different issues, and how do we not attack but reshape these systems so that we can move forward as a people and a nation in a time where we're basically a country at war, not only abroad but against ourselves still, and we ignore it?
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, I think what you're asking is a great question, and I don't know if I have the answer. But this is the place where these kind of discussions should happen. Within our educational institutions, talk about these, in some cases, these taboo issues. People don't want to talk about racism. Racism is one of those taboo subjects, and sometimes our professors get into trouble when they address it within the classroom. Because we've been all socialized to believe that America is a just society and that racism is part of our past. And we know that that is not true, that there's a lot of work to be done. And part of that is educating yourself and getting these things. And when I say these things, I'm talking about these mascot things, which are so blatantly racist and have a purpose, which is to keep Indian people invisible and in the past tense, because America has a hard time dealing with its history. And it's an American thing to play Indian. That's also part of our socialization. You see it in the Boy Scouts. You see it in this secret society that's here. And, that's actually more complex than I'm even able to address. In fact, you have professors here that are actually pretty good at addressing that issue, Philip Delory. And I suggest that you have good resources right here, and Professor Deloria is right there. Hello. But we have to know that we are charged, that it's to do more than just celebrate and to remember the leaders during the civil rights movement. We can't just remember and link arms and sing "We Will Overcome" and then feel like we've all done it and gone home and feel comfortable. We have work to do to educate ourselves. And we have, as I'm going to quote Michael Haney, who worked very hard and in many ways stayed many, many days away from his own family. He said, "I must do everything I can so that I don't pass this problem on to the next generation." And I think that that's the charge, is that we all must work very hard so that we don't pass this on to the next generation to deal with. So I think we need to work together, us elders, with the young generation to figure out new ways. Because in some ways, even the old ways of protest and holding signs, they've gotten very used to that, haven't they? I mean, they practically don't pay attention to the anti-war protests anymore. I think we have to find creative ways to address these issues, and that's why for me, I use my art. And I create installations that make it impossible, hopefully, for people to walk away and feel comfortable. It's about eroding the comfort level of this activity. We've become very numb in this country. It's about waking people up, and this is the place for us to have those conversations. It's within the university. So I don't know if I have an answer, but it gives me a great deal of hope to hear from our young people who are thinking about how to do this, how to make the next step.
Since the protest at the University of Illinois, has there been any changes, or have you kept in contact with the powers to be in terms of changes have been implemented at that university since that time?
For me, the University of Illinois is just that local definition of a national problem. So for me, I then went to I worked at the National Congress of American Indians And while I was there, I was working around the whole Redskin image. So how I see all of these is that they're local definitions of this national problem. So I don't exactly just address one issue or one mascot image anymore, and to try to create a movement around this. So the movement is truly a movement now, in that people are talking about this across the country. And there are some very powerful young students at the University of Illinois who have carried on that struggle. And I keep hearing about them. I think someone was telling me that today, and there was someone who was a former student, there she is, who was telling me about how they continued the struggle. There has been some progress in that the NCAA ruling regarding those universities that have mascots, they can't take that on the road anymore to postseason games. And so there has been some progress, but it's like a 10-step program. It's like they're trying to wean themselves away from this racism. And so I think they're maybe at step 3 or something like that. They have a few more steps to go. And maybe we need to help them with their program. But there is some young people who continue the struggle at the University of Illinois. I think the big barrier is the Board of Trustees, who has the authority and the power to make the right decision. They just have chosen not to. They know that Indian country stands, together, as organizations, and have made it clear through their resolutions and through letters. They have just chosen to not hear it. And that's what I mean by the power of these stereotypes to dehumanize, so that you can continue to disregard the leadership across the country. There has been progress in that. I think that there is a great deal of awareness across the country. And the other part is that young people are on the front lines now. Young meaning I'm talking about teenagers who are grooming their leadership skills through this issue. So for me, I have a great deal of hope that we're going to make some change, and hopefully within my lifetime.